Okay, tonight we're going to talk about Objective 5.4, which is describing World War I, major changes from previous wars, and the global impact. So this packet from our gallery walk today should be numbered number 4. You should be on the last page for our notes on our weapons. So the first weapon we have is a flamethrower. It was small and lightweight. It could be carried by one person. It sprayed burning fuel on victims, so it was petroleum. It's what we put in our car, and it sprayed this fuel, which is very flammable, while it was on fire. It was useful in trench attacks because it would lead men to climb out of the trenches, but it was not useful in attacks over long distances. It couldn't go very far. So that was one of the limitations. On to our next weapon. Our next weapon is chemical weapons. So they were put in shells and fired at enemies, almost like grenades. Mustard gas was the deadliest kind. It would cause permanent lung damage. Others just caused temporary, so that the opponent was momentarily crippled. The downside is the wind often carried chemicals back to the soldiers who threw them. So even if you were on the offense, you also had to wear a gas mask, because you couldn't quite control where the gas would land. Trenches are a different form of weaponry that we might not always think about, because defense mechanisms are also artillery or weapons. And so trenches were long lines of zigzag ditches. They were surrounded by barbed wire, and in between the trenches from either team or either enemy was called no man's land. That was in your gallery walk. No man's land would be full of mines and holes and barbed wire. And trench fighting was better than charging at each other across an open field when the opponent had machine guns and artillery. Next we have artillery, which are big guns. So they're different than machine guns. They can't shoot as frequently, but the blast is much larger. So it's the largest mobile guns used on the battlefield. They're almost like the first original rocket launchers. They could fire a 2,100-pound shell more than 9 miles, so very, very far at attacking tanks, planes, etc. So you could attack planes from the ground, which caused a lot of problem with our reconnaissance efforts by plane. They delivered small lead balls and poison gas. They could blast through barbed wire, but as you guys saw at the Battle of the Somme, they didn't necessarily tear apart the barbed wire, but they could get through it. And they were responsible for about half of World War I's battle casualties. So these were the biggest affected guns from World War I. Next we have battleships, which originated in World War I. They were heavily armed and armored ships. And actually they were tried out before World War I with our efforts at colonialism overseas. Battleships fought naval battles using torpedoes and deck-mounted guns. So these battleships would face off with one. Tanks were developed during World War I. They could be driven over barbed wire and other dangerous materials. So tanks were a good solution to the trench warfare and no man's land. They could be steered across ditches and up steep embankments, so they could go down steep hills and up. So they could climb over trenches. But especially World War I tanks often failed, had easily glitches. They had weak spots that if they got hit with an artillery gun, they would be incapacitated or even explode. Then we have machine guns, which are rapid firing guns. They could stop the advance of a much larger group. And they caused high levels of casualties. Especially early on in the war when we didn't have the idea of trench warfare yet. Submarines. Submarines were a German invention. Submarines could move silently under the surface of the ocean and came to the surface just before torpedoing their targets. So essentially they were invisible. And so this was a great tactic early on before we had radios and satellites. So the Germans had a huge advantage with their submarines. They were sinking battleships left and right. They were responsible for sinking the majority of ships, and they worked in a convoy system. So what would happen is if you had a merchant ship that needed to deliver goods, you would surround it by submarines. And so these submarines would serve to protect the... Just quiet. Also, there were airplanes. Airplanes were able to fly over 120 miles per hour. They were mostly used for reconnaissance. We don't have like bombs being able to be dropped from airplanes at this point. They were later paired with machine guns so that two planes could actually fight each other in the air. And that way they had combat. All right, so we are in the unfortunate circumstance of only having one day for World War I because we started school so late, so we need to catch up. So tonight is an online lecture on World War I. It is number 2, and you should be taking notes on the guided notes you received in class. Today's going to look a little bit more at big picture World War I, what drew the U.S. in, how was World War I a shifting point. For example, why should it create a new unit? The age of global. So first we have the major players. On one side you have the Triple Entente, which are the Allies. And one way to help remember this is Triple Entente. Entente is a French word, and the French were part of the Allies, if that helps you. And in the Allied powers were Britain, France, and Russia, later to be joined by the United States. And then our central powers are in the center of Europe. That'll help you remember. And they are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which will become Turkey. And so think of it as the Triple Entente hugs the central powers, and I have a map for you. One thing to note that's important is because colonization is still going on, World War I becomes a world war. It's not just a war in Europe and the United States. All our mother countries are dragging in their colonies to help create resources. Britain brings in soldiers from India. And a lot of production, especially of raw materials and food, is shifted, the responsibility is shifted to colonies. And then we have our map. You can see Russia, Britain, and France are all one color. This is 1914, so the U.S. is not in yet. And then the central powers in the center of Europe are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, and so as we mentioned, the U.S. is not yet involved in the war, and you might be wondering where we are. At this point in U.S. politics, we have a policy of isolationism. We keep to ourselves. No American president has yet traveled to Europe, for example, across the ocean as a diplomatic mission. Thomas Jefferson did, but not as president. It was prior to being president, so just a note. But the U.S. is keeping to itself. We're focused on internal affairs, the exception being the rest of the Americas, Latin America, right? With the Monroe Doctrine, we are involved in the Americas, but we're not really looking further than that. So we have a policy of isolationism. But that is going to change, and two key events cause this change. The first is 1915. We get very annoyed by the sinking of the Lusitania. And the Lusitania is a cruise ship, but it has military and civilian American citizens on it. And it's sunk outside of Britain and Ireland, and it's sunk by a German U-boat. And so this is actually why Germany gains an early advantage in the war, is they have this fleet of submarines, U-boats, more developed than anyone else's, and we don't yet have the technology, the sonar and the radar to be tracking them all the time. And the reason Germany would sink this U-boat is that sink this cruise ship is even though we have declared neutrality, we are sending supplies to Britain. So we're helping them. They've shifted their economy to producing goods for the war, and the citizens still need food and need basic goods. So we're neutral, but we are helping out the Allied powers. And so Germany sinks the ship. It has our civilians on it, and we take this very personally. Over 1,000 people have died. And this bugs us. The next is a telegram called the Zimmerman telegram that we intercept in 1917. I'm going to put it up. So I encourage you to take a second. I'll give you a second to read it after this. But essentially what it says is it reaches out to Mexico. And it says, you know, Mexico, should the U.S. decide to get involved in this war, we want to be ready, and we want you to be ready, and we want to work with you. So we want you to be ready to invade the U.S. And potentially act as a base for us to invade the U.S. And what Germany promises Mexico is the territory that they lost in the the Mexican-American War. So this is Texas, New Mexico, the southwest of the United States. And so we intercept this telegram and take it as offensive. It's Germany anticipating us joining the war and them trying to make an alliance with one of our allies, and we have the Monroe Doctrine where Europe is not supposed to get involved with Latin America, and so they violate that. And this is one of the turning points that causes us to actually enter the war. So again, we're acting as isolationists. Just a political cartoon to help you. You have Europe, Uncle Sam, or Europe on one side, Uncle Sam across the pond, and we are basically telling Europe that your old ways, we don't want to get involved, and what they're doing is bloodletting, which that used to be a medical treatment. When someone was sick, you would cut them and let the blood out, and that was that you were bleeding out the bad blood, and they would be helpful. And we're saying, don't look for us to be a blood donor. Your archaic, outdated methods, we don't want anything to do with it. So our expectations of World War I and Britain's and everyone in the war was that it would be very short war. And so there was this home by Christmas mentality. Both sides thought it would be a short skirmish. And there hadn't actually, the current soldiers and the current people under about 30 hadn't fought in a war. They didn't know why war was bad. They saw it as like glorified. And so that was the propaganda, that there hadn't been a major war in 50 years. People didn't have a full reality of the damage that war could do. And so nationalism and propaganda were used to encourage volunteers. And you can see here in this poster an example of the nationalism and the propaganda and the way that war was glorified. You have, right, a knight fighting a dragon. It's bringing back these old ideas of like how honored and heroic soldiers were. And so that's one thing to keep in mind, because World War I starts in 1914, and it lasts for much longer than till Christmas, right? All the way until 1919. So the reality of World War I looked very differently. Germany, again, has this Schleifen plan, apologies for my pronunciation, to sneak through Belgium into France, whereas France is defending the Alsace-Lorraine territory. Alsace-Lorraine is the territory where Germany and France touch. So Germany's plan is to go through Belgium and surprise the soldiers and show up behind them and have this blitzkrieg surprise attack. Their plan fails, and what ends up happening is a long war, a stalemate on the Western Front, trench warfare where a few miles might be gained day by day, gained, then lost, then gained, and the whole countryside is destroyed. Germans do advance on Paris, but they don't capture it. And essentially, there's this territory of about 30 to 40 miles where the war just goes back and forth for 3 years. And it causes tremendous destruction and death of soldiers. They just keep killing each other to no gains. And so here is a map to show you. So you can see the territory on the right that says Lorraine and Alsace, and that is where the French soldiers had defended the border, but the German plan to sneak up north and go through Belgium, the French are able to react quick enough with the British, and but mostly it's French at this point. The British haven't brought in a bunch of soldiers yet. and the trenches dig in, and you can see how little territory shifts over the time period. And so they just go back and forth along the Western Front. So just a reminder that the majority of these weapons were used along the Western Front on the border between France and Germany/Belgium, where we had our trench warfare and a standoff. The Eastern Front, so that's the Western Front. The Eastern Front is with Russia. Germany has to fight a two-front war. They are divided. They had France on the west and Russia on the east, which means they need to split their troops. So Russia had a huge amount of soldiers. So Russia had the largest army. However, their soldiers were untrained peasants. They were given pitchforks, rudimentary weapons, and minimal training. German forces were better armed, better led, better trained, but there weren't as many. As a result of the lack of training on the Russian side, casualties were extremely high, and Russian commanders were ineffective. They hadn't really fought a war before. They weren't sure what to do. So as a result, we have a lot of peasant revolts and mutinies. The Russian soldiers would fight back and rebel against their commanders, sometimes killing them. Russia starts to have a revolution internally, and so they're forced to withdraw from the war in 1917. But this is after many Russian soldiers actually crossed over to the German side and just started fighting against their own captains out of bitterness. On Christmas, the Russians could hear the Germans celebrating and partying, and so they put down their guns and crossed the lines and celebrated with the Germans. The Russian soldiers, the messages, were not very invested in this war. Here is an image of the Eastern Front. Notice the border, it's along Poland, Russia, Ukraine. And there we have our German soldiers surrendering. In 1917, they had to give back a fair amount of land in order to be able to peacefully. So to review, we have trench warfare, which leads to trench foot, post-traumatic stress disorder, disease. Here's a typical trench. Soldiers wearing gas masks because of poison gas being tossed into the one has been overturned. So as you can see, our tanks were a great idea, but the technology was not very sophisticated. In World War I times, many tanks would flip over, their tracks would fall off and they'd get stuck, or they had a weakness in the underside, and if artillery hit it, it would blow up. Again, even if you were firing gas mask or poison gas, you had to wear a gas mask because you couldn't control where the wind would blow, and the chemicals would often be blown back at the offensive side. Our first military planes. Notice only one person can fly them. It's not like we think of planes today. Battleship being sunk by a U-boat. Examples of barbed wire and machine gun fire. Here you go, a machine gun. So this required several people. A lot of times these machine guns would jam and you needed an engineer to unjam them. You had somebody who had to carry the cartridges and the ammo. Here we have before. This is a northeastern French village on the upper left, before, and then after. So you can see the destruction that this new technology caused. Very expensive for France, which is one of the reasons they demanded so much in reparations from the German government at the end of the war. For soldiers, again, they had to live in the trenches, which meant they were constantly experiencing deafening noise and sudden flashes. It was very cold. They had little sleep. They were sleeping in water, which again, remember, was full of rats and fleas and feces. They would get trench foot. Your skin just can't be underwater for that long. It starts to rot. Rats and lice were commonplace. Yum. So sanitation was horrid. You're not going to risk your life just to go to the bathroom. So there's a spot in the right? So soldiers suffered what they called originally war neurosis or combat stress. Now we know this as PTSD. Symptoms include tiredness, irritability, lack of concentration, headaches. You could even have mental breakdown occur where you don't know where you are or what's happening. Unfortunately, this had never been diagnosed before, and so it was seen as weakness, right? Treatment wasn't considered. Instead, it was, you're being a coward, get back in the trenches, get to work. So why was World War I so much more devastating than previous wars? The new technology, artillery, machine guns, poison gas, combined with outdated defense tactics like frontal assaults against machine guns. Doesn't work so well. And a lot of soldiers didn't die from the new weapons, they died from health and bad hygiene. Trench warfare spread disease and the flu very quickly when you're sleeping outside at night in water and it's winter. Death was very common. Wounds weren't treated properly. If you got hurt and you were surrounded by this dirt and mud and feces, they oftentimes got infected. Here you have a hospital situation. This is when women became very important as nurses. So you should now be taking Cornell notes. These are also number 4. And the effects of... So again, World War I was a global war. This cartoon should look familiar from today's gallery walk. And besides Austria-Hungary, all our major countries involved in the war have colonies, and so they dragged their colonies in, demanded resources from their colonies. And so one key strategy Britain employed was to block Germany from reaching its colonies and bringing in additional resources. This is where we have the Battle of Jutland. So they blocked the North Sea, the sea route from Germany to get around to Africa. There it is, the 1914 naval blockade of Germany. Germany did not have a lot of land access, so they were easy to block. So in World War I, Japan is an ally with the Allies, with Britain, which will change in World War II. Britain has many dominions, not necessarily colonies, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And these provide manpower for soldiers, manpower for production, and resources like food. We also have a large number of soldiers from India who come to Europe and fight in the war. On this map, you can see the British Empire. So all these nations were dragged to some degree into the war. Go ahead and list in your notes some of the nations involved. Take a look at the casualties. Again, this can mean death or serious injuries. So the largest percentage you'll see is Austria-Hungary. But the largest number, if you look at Russia, they had 12 million soldiers. Right? And they weren't even in the war the entire time. So they just kept feeding untrained soldiers to the front lines to die. And then you can see that they also have the largest total number of casualties by well over 2 million. So drastic defeat in a way, even though they aren't defeated for Russia, which is one of the key causes of the revolution, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. So here you can see the breakdown of killed versus wounded casualties. Here's another breakdown to get a better visual by country. But Russia wins far and away. So on the home front, civilians are often unaware of the horrors soldiers faced on the front. If you remember back to our British newspaper journalist and the article they wrote about what a nice day it was on the day of the battle, and they portrayed the British soldiers as brave and leaping to save the empire. They don't describe any of the deaths or horrible conditions for the soldiers. And so it was easy for the people at home to have a great deal of patriotism and support for the war. They didn't see the evils and the dark side of the war. Propaganda was often used to rally support for the war effort. You looked at some of those examples today. Industry was shifted and geared towards the war effort. So all the machine companies shifted to make tanks, to make guns, etc. And women's participation in the labor force increased greatly. So women went to work in the factories, women went to work in the hospitals, and so they replaced a lot of the male jobs. So World War I ends with an armistice signed. So German advances on the Western Front are slowed, and then the Americans swoop in at the last minute and look like heroes because we're able to quickly and easily defeat the Germans. So German commanders agreed to an armistice on November 11th, 1918. Remember, an armistice is an agreement to stop. Okay, so attempts at peace. This is a recap on your reading last night. The Allied powers meet in Paris to work out the terms of the German surrender. The Germans are not invited. In fact, well, they have to come to sign the treaty, but they're not invited to the bargaining table. In fact, German delegates are snuck in the back service door. They aren't even allowed to enter in the front door. And during the negotiations, the Germans are embarrassingly asked to stand on the side around the table. So they end up having to stand and listen to the future of their country being negotiated for approximately 4 to 5 hours. This is just pouring salt in German wounds, right? It's just trying to offend them and assert power. So Germany, again, did not have an impact on the terms. They had to sit on the sidelines, or more literally stand on the sidelines. So France, suffering the greatest damages, wants Germany to pay very high reparations to help rebuild their northeastern section, to help repay for their lost soldiers. Okay, in this image here, we have on the left the British government officials. Then in the middle with the woolly mustache, you have George Clemenceau of France. And on the right, you have Woodrow Wilson, the American president. So Germany's punishment is they have to pay an extreme amount of reparations. They have to give up territory on both sides of their country. So they give back a lot of territory to Poland. Poland doesn't currently exist, and Germany gives the territory back so Poland can rebuild. And they're forced to downsize their military to almost nothing. Austria-Hungary is broken up. It is no longer an empire. Oh, also Germany has to give away all its colonies. So Austria-Hungary is disbanded. It's broken up into Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Austria, and Hungary. Poland is rebuilt and given chunks of territory back. And President Wilson calls for self-determination. So he's mostly talking about these nations like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, but he says that nations should be able to decide what type of government they have. However, he's not talking to the colonies in Africa and Asia. He means the white people in Eastern and Western Europe. Independence for the colonies will be to come. But there are Arab representatives who are at this meeting in the Treaty of Paris, and they're expecting to be rewarded for their service and aid during the war, and instead they're completely ignored. Promises made to Arabs who helped during the war are forgotten, and these contributions of the colonies are totally ignored. Go ahead and make a prediction about what might happen in the next 50 years. So here we have a cartoon of At the Peace Table, and that man who looks kind of like the maitre d' with the big woolly mustache is George Clemenceau from France. He's the leader of France. And he is inviting the German delegates to the table, and he's saying, take your seats, gentlemen, and take a look at the table. What do we have here? A trap, right? It's booby-trapped. There are handcuffs. They're meant to drink poison. So the idea here is that Germany is going to pay dearly because France is so resentful and wants revenge. Okay, so the end of World War II ends with the Treaty of Versailles. We're going to watch the video on the Treaty of Versailles tomorrow. But go ahead in your notes and write down who thinks that this treaty is a positive development, and I don't mean who like which students, I mean which countries. And which countries feel that the Treaty of Versailles is not a positive development. Okay, part of the treaty is the League of Nations, which you also read about last night. But the idea was created by Woodrow Wilson, U.S. President, And he said we shouldn't punish Germany. Rather, we should keep our friends close and our enemies closer and create a league with Germany. So Wilson writes the 14 points. He wanted to create peace and balance of power so that each country felt like it was contributing and responsible to one another. Wilson's League of Nations would work to preserve peace and establish humanitarian goals. They could be an international organization that would intervene in international affairs. However, Wilson's own Congress votes that the United States should not enter the League of Nations. This is a huge embarrassment for Wilson. It's saying my own people don't support my plan. They think it's a failure. So here's an American political cartoon of Wilson blowing his idealism bubbles of the League of Nations. And we also have another one. We told you it wouldn't work, and so this is also American. You can see on the sidelines you have Uncle Sam, right? He's sitting on a wheel that appears to go to this fire truck. And he's saying, well, ha ha ha, why don't you go put out the fire? And you can see the Congress is the one kind of laughing and pointing at this fire truck of clowns of the League of Nations. So think about how effective the League of Nations is going to be at putting out a fire without the important wheel that is the United States. So in conclusion, World War I was devastating to European countries involved. There was a high death toll, high wounded toll, major damage done to the infrastructure of these nations and to the workforce, right? If you have a high death and wounded toll, that's a lot of workers who are out of commission. That is going to put a tax on the economies of those nations. And the Treaty of Versailles did very little to change that balance of power. Colonies weren't rewarded for their service. Germany was severely, perhaps arguably, over-punished. And this led to growing resentment that would lead to more conflicts